Why do I want to roll these two chapters together and kind of fuse them into one? Is it just because they're short? No, the first one's short, but the second one really isn't. It's because a lot of these themes and events are overlapping with each other quite a bit. The American Revolution was, in part, a political revolution. But it's also, like your book points out, to some degree also a religious revolution. Some of the things that were going on in the history and the story up until this point are preparing their way for the revolution. It was a revolution in part against the British king, but also against the British church. And this notion of sort of top-down governance. You see that the groups in the United States who particularly stressed local authority, like the Puritans, the Congregationalists, right? Individual churches covenant with each other. The Presbyterians, they were the ones who were really the backbone of the revolution. You see some other groups, predictably enough, like the Quakers or the Anabaptists, what we often call the peace churches, trying to remain neutral. Why would they do that? That's an expression of their religion. Other groups, unfortunately for them, the Anglicans, many of them actually sided against the revolution with the British crown and suffered because of it. Some of them had to go up to Canada when their goods were confiscated. Some of them fought as Tories in militia against the Revolutionary Army and the militias, and then had to find themselves kind of scarce. So this was not just a political event, but it was something that actually divided in part along religious lines. Like your book points out, the First Great Awakening is, in a certain respect, the first truly American event, in the sense of something that unites all the colonies and produces a consciousness of Americans versus British, us versus them over there who are telling us what to do. So you can read the whole history that you guys remember from your early American history classes in high school, or things you've taken here about the Stamp Act and the Tea Party and all those sorts of things. You can read that into this religious framework as well. Now, I don't want to talk that much about the beginnings of the revolution. I want to talk about the effect of it. Unlike many revolutions, it's actually successful. So what's the next thing you have to do after you've had a successful revolution? Besides party, have a good time because you kicked the bad guys out. What do you need to do?
Maintain what you've worked to.
Bless you. Yeah. So you have to find some way to, let's say, consolidate the gains, right? Consolidate the achievements. And what was this one about? Achieve. Nice. They wanted the British king and the Parliament out of their business. They wanted to be self-governing, and so they were. Now that brings about a whole set of other problems, right? To be self-governing, once you no longer, you guys are familiar with this from going to college, right? When you were living at home under mom and dad's rules, perhaps you rebelled against them and you broke your curfew or stuff like that, but you were still, within some sort of structure, weren't you? Unless you were a totally rebellious kid. But once you get to college, what happens your first semester here? What sort of temptations do you face?
You get in trouble for drinking.
There's that. That can happen in high school, though, too, right? What else? More specifically about the kind of lifestyle that you're living. I guess drinking, I suppose, would be part of that lifestyle, but what else? Is there anyone who's going to make you? Yeah.
You're just on your own. So you're on your own, so you can pretty much do what you want. So, there's no law enforcement going on.
Yeah, if you don't show up to class, what's the teacher going to do? Are they going to call your mom and dad, and like they would in high school, and say, Jimmy hasn't been in class for several periods. Maybe you should have a talk with him. That's not going to happen. You decide when you're going to wake up. You decide what you want to do, if you're going to apply yourself. If you're going to blow things off, you decide what your social life is going to look like. That's self-governance. Now imagine it's not just one person going off to college, but a whole country full of people who don't all see eye to eye about things and are faced with the same basic problems that everybody else is throughout history. You have to keep order. You have to build roads and bridges. You have to regulate commerce. You have to make sure that criminals actually get taken off the streets and locked up or whipped or hung or whatever you're going to do with them. There's a lot of whipping and hanging back then compared to locking up, compared to now. You have to do a lot of things in terms of governance. And at the start, they're states, right? And they have these Articles of Confederation that don't actually work very well. There's discussions about the United States actually breaking up into 4 different countries. I don't know if any of you have ever read the Federalist Papers or the Anti-Federalist Papers, but those were live proposals at the time to have 4 different countries because they thought of themselves as very different from each other. And some of the differences had to do with, let's say, religious differences. The southern states, the Anglican Church had dominated, and you had a few areas where, Presbyterians would dominate, or Baptists were moving down there. New England was dominated by the Puritans, wasn't it? Remember, for a while, if you weren't a Puritan, you had to get out of there. You had to go over to Rhode Island or Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was a whole different ballgame. Anybody was welcome in Pennsylvania, more or less. New York was its own kind of weird animal as well. New Jersey was heavily dominated by Presbyterians. All these different states, some of them may have a state religion, some of them may be completely against that sort of thing. So they had to figure out some way to make this actually work. And there's the danger, if they don't make it work, the British are going to come back in, or the French will come down from the north and eventually take over. This is a danger that stayed around, by the way, all the way through the Civil War. The British and the French were sitting on the sidelines during the Civil War, just waiting for the nation to fall apart. The Russians actually sent ships, believe it or not, to sort of ward off the French and Germans, the French and the English from that. So your book lays this out as a real set of issues that have to be worked out. And one of the things that we want to think about with this is what your book calls, is a long word, disestablishment. That's part of the American experience. There were state churches. As a matter of fact, in most countries in Europe, there was a state church at this time. Could be the Anglican Church, could be the Lutheran Church, could be the Reformed Church, but it was going to be some church. Somebody was in charge. Somebody was probably actually getting paid from the state taxes to support their particular view of Christianity. That was still going on in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, to a certain extent in Virginia with the Anglicans at the time of the Revolution. So the question was, should they move towards no, what does this mean? This means no state supported or official church. Nobody gets an advantage over everybody else. Like your book says, Pennsylvania and Rhode Island kind of led the way. Rhode Island didn't have a state church. Rhode Island was where you could go if you didn't fit into the established churches in the other colonies. Pennsylvania, deliberately set up to be diverse in that respect. Maryland, to a certain extent, until they voted it out. The other middle colonies, New York, Delaware, New Jersey, had at most limited establishment, and they opted for pluralism. They opted for saying, we won't have any state church when the issue came up. Virginia, your book talks about, it was a hotly debated issue. Should there be a state church or not? And Jefferson and Madison played an important role in making sure that that didn't happen. How does this pan out constitutionally? Is religion mentioned in the Constitution?
Yeah.
Yeah, where is it? There's really only two spots.
First Amendment and
Yeah.
can't think of the other one.
Everybody forgets about the other one, so don't feel bad, because it's kind of buried. Now, the First Amendment is an amendment to the Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights, and so it's not in the original work, right? The Article 6, that's part of the original Constitution. I shouldn't say original, because I mean, with the amendments, they voted on that. That was the working document, right? But Article 6 was part of the original document. And Article 6 forbids religious tests. It says that you can't require somebody to belong to a particular religious group or to not belong to a religious group in order to hold office. So, office, anything from dog catcher all the way up to president should, in theory, be open to everybody, no matter what their religious views are. Doesn't mean that they'll get voted in, right? I mean, if somebody has some sort of religion that says we need to sacrifice every 10th person to goobity, make up some god's name, they're not going to get voted in, hopefully, right? And there's nothing, but there's no exclusion of them. They can put their name on the ballot. They can make up their own party, the Human Sacrifice Party. And then it's left to the voters to decide. First Amendment's been much more important. What is the First Amendment, for those of you that remember this or are into the Constitution, what does it have to say about religion? There's really two main things. Anyone remember? Yeah.
Freedom to practice it and no official state religion.
Very good. So one part is what we call religious liberty or freedom. You're supposed to be allowed to practice your religion without being discriminated against, without being excluded, without suffering penalties because of that. Again, if your religion required human sacrifice once a month, that would be hard to work in, right? Because that interferes with other people's rights, like the right not to die. Pretty important, right? But so long as you're not actually breaking some sort of, not even necessarily written law, but some sort of moral law, you ought to be able to practice your religion. That's what it says. Freedom of religion. And then, no establishment. Congress shall not establish a religion. And there's been lots of debate back and forth about exactly what that means. Here would be just one example that we could use out of the literally hundreds that we might look at in history. For a while, it was common practice that the King James Bible was a textbook in grammar school. They would read portions of it and maybe even talk about it and comment on it. Now, why would that be a problem? King James Bible, that doesn't really belong just to one religious group, right? There's a lot of Protestants that like the King James Bible. Who might that alienate by doing that? Catholics into the King James Bible? Probably not, because it was used as sort of a whipping post against the Catholics. What about Jews? They're not going to be that happy with Bible reading in school. What about atheists? Think they're going to be up for that? That was put to the test, and we use the Supreme Court for deciding this sort of thing. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do Bible readings in school, not in any sort of devotional way. You could actually read the King James Bible, as an example of British literature, You could teach a Bible as literature class if you wanted to, but you would not be able to teach it as if it is the official religion, or taking a stand and saying this is we're reading this because this is true. You could teach it as this is a historical document that we can look at, for its own intrinsic value as a historical document, but you can't actually make it part of your curriculum. School prayer, falls under the same sort of thing. It used to be that they would actually pray in school, and that got challenged, and that was a matter of establishment. Your book also talks about one other thing in this chapter that I skipped over and we should come back to, because this is actually kind of part of it. And this is this notion of civil religion. And civil religion is a weird kind of hybrid. It's not really the religion of any particular church or denomination. Instead, it's sort of like the religion of the nation. Think of the nation considered as a religious narrative, or think about people who are particularly important in the history being elevated to a kind of sainthood, like George Washington was. George Washington was considered to be a really central character. People talked about him in terms that they would reserve for people like Moses. Who do you think the next really big president like that would be in American history, moving forward from George Washington? It's not Jefferson.
Madison.
No, Madison is kind of I don't want to say a dull guy like Adams, but he certainly doesn't inspire that sort of religious devotion. I like him actually, but yeah.
Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah, now why? It wasn't just the beard, that makes you look kind of patriarchal, but what was it about this guy that would tie in with religious imagery? I mean, the whole Civil War, by the way, shot through with religious imagery. Battle Hymn of the Republic. Read the words. It's about God, smiting the slaveholders and the army of the Lord marching on. It's sung to the tune of John Brown's Body. What was Lincoln known for? Besides getting, in part getting the Civil War going by getting elected.
Freeing the slaves.
Okay, he's the great emancipator. Now that has biblical resonances to it. What happens to him as a result? Not just of, reuniting the Union and making a lot of tough decisions.
He's kind of like a martyr.
Exactly. And for some people, he's made into like a Christ figure. You can find images of Lincoln like this, particularly from that time. He's the one who shed his blood for the nation. That's particularly biblical religious imagery. That's part of American civil religion. Ironic in part because Lincoln didn't go to church. He was raised early on a Baptist, but then more or less leaves all of that sort of stuff behind. But he knew how to use religious imagery very well. If you read the Gettysburg Address, for example, this is still part of American politics, and not just on the part of the right. I don't know, you guys probably don't remember this because you were a bit young at the time, but the last major primary election for the Democrats in 2000, the whole thing got started in about 2006 and went to 2008. The two main candidates were Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and then a whole penumbra of other people as well, Joe Biden and all these other all these other people. Guess where they started their election campaigns? Two churches across from town. We actually, in religious studies, call it dueling churches. Hillary Clinton started, I forget, one started at if I remember right, I think it was an American Methodist Episcopal Church, and the other one an American Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And if I remember right, they both started in Selma, Alabama. It might have been somewhere else in Alabama. And because they were commemorating, civil rights, and each one led a march that began at a church with a sermon. So you've got these Democratic candidates who are doing, using American civil religion, basically, as part of the election campaign. This is really stock in trade. This is not something peculiarly Republican or Democrat. This is something that pervades American politics. And, were they there at those churches because they really cared about that church's perspective on things? No, they wanted something that was kind of representative of what they stood for. That element of it. The civil rights struggle made its way into American civil religion. There's a lot of elements to this. So that's a theme that's going to come up over and over again. I don't want to spend too much time on it. Now let's look at the Second Great Awakening and some of these things that are happening after the American Revolution. I'm going to leave disestablishment up here because that plays a central role in what's going on. So if you can't have an official religion, how do you get people to go to your church? You can't rely on the state to require people to go to your church. Well, people have to choose, right? This is what we call voluntarism. Voluntarism. Your book has kind of a funny term for it. No, voluntarism is what they call it. And what does this mean? Those who belong to a particular church are there because they choose to. It's a voluntary act of their own. Churches are voluntary associations. They're not a government association. They're something that the people themselves want to participate in, want to belong to. Another thing that goes along with this is what your book calls denominationalism. Denomination, it comes from the word to name, to denominate. Nomen in Latin means name. And so different groups would be denominated. We're still kind of tangled language there, isn't it? Denominated on the basis of what it was that tied them together. So if we're talking about Catholics as a denomination, what do Catholics have in common with each other? What makes somebody a Catholic? 7 sacraments, priests aren't married, what are the other things you'd think of with respect to Catholics? That's part of what goes into their denomination. Presbyterians, what makes Presbyterians similar to each other? Belief in predestination, having a Presbyterian structure. They're a denomination. Quakers are a denomination. Baptists are a denomination. Each of them are distinct as a sort of tradition. That's what we've been studying so far. And a lot of what religion in America consists in is learning about different denominations and where they came from, what their history is, how they intersect with each other, why they believe the things that they believe, why they do the things that they do. We're really studying a lot of different denominations. And we even use this term not just for Christian religions. When we look at Judaism, we talk about Jewish denominations. So what makes Hasidic Jews different from Reformed Jews? Think about Hasidic Jews. What are things you associate with them? Particular way of dress? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say kosher law.
They actually follow the kosher law. Most Reformed Jews kind of, it's a much more individualistic thing. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I mentioned when we were talking about Judaism, I think last couple times ago, was the Reformed Jews, they sort of said, screw the kosher laws in such a way that their first main gathering, they had shrimp salad. Shrimp is forbidden by kosher law. So that's something that sets denominations apart. I don't know how well you can apply it to all different religions, but people do. They'll talk about Hinduism. Is somebody a Shiva worshiper, a Saivite, or are they a Vishnu worshiper, a Vaishnavite? So we use this notion of denominationalism quite a bit. And this is all part of the Second Great Awakening. So the first Great Awakening was this, sort of upsurge in religious fervor and ideas and practices. The second one takes place after the American Revolution, and it takes place in a couple phases and in a couple different places. And one of the things that comes out of this, besides volunteerism and denominationalism, let me move disestablishment over here, is what we have come to call evangelism. The term to associate with this is evangelical. So, you've heard of evangelical Christians, which a lot of people mix up with other groups like fundamentalists, totally different group. We'll talk about why later on. Or Pentecostals, different group. Evangelicals, as a sort of self-conscious group, fit into the Second Great Awakening. The term had been around for a while, as your book mentions. It says, who were these evangelicals? The word itself had a long history. But evangelical comes to take on a new meaning in America, partly through this Great Awakening. There's a designation for Anglo-American Protestants that encompasses not just one denomination, but a whole host of Protestant denominations. Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists. So let me actually put those churches down. Congregationalists. Congregationalists. Wish I had somebody to just write this stuff for me because my spelling is slowing me down. Presbyterians. Remember, too, at the time of the Revolution, two largest groups in the United States. Two largest religious groups. Baptists, soon to become one of the major players, and Methodists. Also, what we call low church, Episcopalians. And if you take these in, you're talking about the majority of religious believers in the colonial and then post-revolutionary United States. Who's not on that? Catholics, Jews, High Church Anglicans, Quakers. Remember the Quakers? Well, some of the things that divided them, whether they were becoming evangelical or not. Some of the things that we're seeing now should start to come together for you as we're reading through this. So what makes them into evangelicals? Your book talks about three major traits. One of these is a commitment to the Bible. Bible is the sole source of religion. Sole source of religious authority and revelation. That's not that different than other Protestants, though, right? Martin Luther, sola scriptura. So that's not by itself enough to make you an evangelical. Another thing that we saw come in with the First Great Awakening was an insistence on personal, emotional conversion. Or if we want to speak about it in these terms, heart religion, right? Evangelical Christianity is about the relationship of the individual believer to Christ, and it's not just through the head, it's through the heart, it's through the emotions or the religious affections, and it requires some sort of conversion narrative to be there. And then third, this is where the word evangelical actually takes us, is what they're calling in the book the mission imperative. Go out and spread the gospel. The word evangelical, by the way, comes from the word for gospel. In Greek, it's evangelion, the good news. And then in Latin, it becomes evangelium. So in French, it's still the Évangile. The Gospel of St. John would be the Évangile de Saint Jean. And so this word evangelical is actually coming from the roots for gospel. So when you see evangelical, think gospel, going out and actually spreading it. That's what the mission imperative part means. That it's not enough just to have one's own personal relationship with God. One has to also go out and offer that to other people. So you'll see evangelicals saying things like, I'd like to tell you about Jesus, my personal Lord and Savior. Do you have a couple minutes? I'd like to tell you this story about how I used to be a drug addict and he changed me, etc. We could go into a lot of different stories like this, right? That's part of what it means to be an evangelical. Not to keep your proverbial light under a bushel. To hide it under a bucket. So evangelicalism is a major part of this Great Awakening. And it fits in very well with these focuses on voluntarism and denominationalism. If you don't like the church that you're in, if it doesn't, appeal to you, because there's nothing really there that's gripping you emotionally, just go to another church. That's what voluntarism means. You don't have to go to the state church, because there isn't any state church. Go to the church that actually suits your needs the best. So if you find yourself attracted to the Baptist way, it sounds like the Baptist church, the Baptist denomination, is for you. If you find yourself more drawn to order and structure, then maybe the Methodist church is the church for you, or the Presbyterian church. All these sorts of things sort of fit in with each other. And your book talks about some of the geography of this, and I'm actually going to skip over quite a bit of that. There's a few things that are particularly important that I want to pick out, since we're getting very short on time. One is your book talks about revivals. And so I should put this as an actual fourth term. And let's call it revivalism, since we've got all these other isms up there. What's a religious revival? It's where you'd have preachers that would come in, and very often people would set up a tent village. And then there'd be a particular area where preaching was going on more or less nonstop. And people would come from all around, and then things would start happening. As your book mentions, during one of these the Cane Ridge Festival, all sorts of things start happening to people, psychomotor things like barking, jerking, falling, dancing, laughing. All of these are things that we might look at and say, wow, that person's like having a seizure. But they interpreted that as the Holy Spirit acting through that person, the Holy Spirit sort of gripping them. This, by the way, is going to be leading later on to other things like that. And this having these revivals every so often became part of American Protestantism, at least Evangelical Protestantism. Your book also mentions this guy, Finney. And this is something that perhaps some of you can either relate to by experience or you've seen this on TV. He made some innovations, like the anxious bench. That's a seat placed near the revivalist on which those who appear to be on the brink of conversion could be placed and then worked on intensively. When they have altar calls and they say, you, I can tell the Spirit is working in you, come on down here. And then you stand in front of me and I start one-on-one dialoguing with you. That's the equivalent of the anxious bench that they're talking about here. There, I'd have you sit on a bench and talk to you like that. Nowadays, everyone stands up. Protracted meetings that would go on for a much longer time, are likely to produce these sorts of conversions. So the Second Great Awakening, here's a great line that they have. Revivalists were the shock troops of this initiative, and the revivals helped to secure beachheads. You guys understand this military terminology? Like when we had D-Day and we invaded France, northern France, knock the Nazis out. You have the beachhead, which you first take, and then you have to fortify that, and then you fan out into the countryside. So the revivalists would sort of establish the beachhead, and then the churches would come in after them. Which churches? These churches. Mostly Baptists and Methodists, some Presbyterians. And they would consolidate those gains. The revivalists might get all these people converted, but then they have to have a place to go. They need some structure. So, like it says, the Baptists and Methodists really did well with this. Why? Remember how we talked a couple classes ago about portable religion? If you don't have to have a lot of apparatus, like you don't need a bishop telling you what to do, or you don't need a special church so that you can do all the rituals, it's very easy to transport that from place to place. Remember, we're talking about a nation which is in the process of expanding, and it's always expanding along the frontier, and the frontier is always underdeveloped until they reach where the French were, like in St. Louis, and then they're surprised to find mansions there. But for the most part, they're always going out to the wilderness, and they have to establish new order, new churches. If you can have a church just by getting people together, building a building, and grab a Bible and start talking, that's very easy to move from place to place to place. So this is what we often call a low church emphasis. Another word for that is evangelical. This is where evangelical Christianity really has its origins, antedating fundamentalist Christianity or Pentecostal Christianity.